צהריים טובים, good afternoon. אני אנצל את התרגום הסימולטני ואני אדבר בעברית, אני חושבת שכולם נעשה את זה. אני שמחה לארח אתכם במרכז לאומנות דיגיטלית בחולון, ואני רוצה להודות לכל המשתתפים שהסכימו לקחת חלק בהרצאות ובדיונים. אני רוצה להודות גם לכל האורחים שהגיעו להאזין ולהשתתף בכנס. אני מקווה שמלבד ההרצאות נוכל לנהל גם דיון לגבי האחריות שלנו לשדה האומנות, לגבי האחריות שלנו לגבי המוזיאונים. אל הכנס הזמנו מנהלי מוזיאונים לשעבר ותיאורטיקנים, להציג את מודל המוזיאון איתו הם עובדים, ואת החזון המוביל אותם בעבודתם המוזיאלית. במהלך 10 השנים האחרונות אנו עדים לשינויים משמעותיים בשדה האומנות הגלובלי המשפיע גם על השדה המקומי. פתיחתם של חללי תצוגה המנוהלים על ידי אמנים, חללי תצוגה ציבוריים שאינם מוזיאונים, פריחה של גלריות מסחריות ופסטיבלים, אירועי אומנות וביאנלות. כל אלה משנים את הנגישות של הקהל והאומנים לחללי התצוגה, מוניציפליים, לאומיים, פרטיים. מה תפקידו של המוזיאון היום כאשר תערוכות גדולות בעלות תקציבים גדולים, צנועים או עצומים מציעות חשיפה לאומנות עכשווית? מה תפקידו של המוזיאון כאשר ביותר ויותר חללי תצוגה נפתחים לקהל ולאומנים? וכיצד מוזיאונים שונים מתמודדים עם בניית האוסף או תצוגתו ההיסטורית או אחרת, כאשר זה אולי אחד הפרמטרים הברורים המבדילים את המוזיאון מחללי תצוגה אחרים, או מאפשרויות תצוגה אחרות? ובאיזה אופן מתמודד המוזיאון העכשווי עם תצוגת אומנות עכשווית? הטריגר לכנס הייתה החלטתם של 6 מוזיאונים לחגוג את החג הלאומי יום העצמאות ה-60 של מדינת ישראל. ב6 תערוכות המחלקות את האומנות הישראלית ל6 עשורים, כאשר כל עשור מוצג במוזיאון אחר. אני רוצה להדגיש שהטריגר הוא לא מונע משאלות של טעם או איכות העבודות האומנות או האוצרות, או איזה עבודות נבחרו לייצג כל עשור. אלא נובע מהשאלה אחת מרכזית, כיצד היום אחרי 41 שנות כיבוש מוכנים המוזיאון או מי שעומד בראשם לעמוד לצד האתוס הלאומי ולחזקו, וכיצד מוותרים המוזיאונים על האוטונומיה של תוכנית התערוכות שלהם לטובת פרוגרמה לאומית. ושאלה שנייה אולי צריכה להפנות לאומנים המשתתפים בתערוכות אלה. המוזיאון הוא חלק מהזהות הלאומית ועוזר לבנותה, הוא מקלקל אותה בכף. שדה האומנות הישראלית חגג לפני 2 100 שנה לאומנות ישראלית דרך חגיגות בצלאל, והנה חגגנו 60 שנה לאומנות ישראלית. תערוכות נושא כדלות החומר או העיניים של המדינה ועוד רבות מייצרות נרטיבים שונים של קריאה ציונית של האומנות שנוצרה בארץ. 2 המוזיאונים הגדולים בארץ, מוזיאון ישראל ומוזיאון תל אביב, עובדים בפני שיפוצים משמעותיים אשר ישנו את חללי התצוגה שלהם, אך גם את הנגישות לעבודות, ובאיזה אופן זה ישפיע על מבנה ואפשרויות של תצוגה ישראלית, עכשווית ובינלאומית. ובמהלך השנה האחרונה בביקורים חוזרים בבלקן ובמזרח אירופה, הבחנתי שכמעט כל המוזיאונים, אם לא כולם, נמצאים במצב זה או אחר של שיפוץ, הגדלה או בנייה, ואחת השאלות שעולות, איזה סוג של תופעה משקפת את המגמה הזאת. אם אני מביטה אחורה על 7 השנים האחרונות בישראל, אני יכולה לציין מגמה של פתיחת יותר גלריות וחללי תצוגה. מוזיאון פתח תקווה נפתח מחדש, וגם מוזיאון בת ים שינה כיוון. ושוב, כמו שציינתי, מוזיאון ישראל ומוזיאון תל אביב עובדים לפני שיפוצים, מוזיאון ישראל בעצם כבר התחילו. אני מקווה שהתוכנית שהכנו ליומיים הקרובים תהיה מרתקת ותוסיף שאלות, ואולי גם הבנות על השדה שאנו פועלים, המקומי והבינלאומי. היום הראשון של הכנס יעסוק בתפקיד של המוזיאון כמפרק וכבונה של אידיאולוגיות. ההרצאות שנשמע יתארו חללי תצוגה ותהליכי עבודה אשר קרו במקביל להשתנות פוליטית ותרבותית, אם בין משטר קומוניסטי לקפיטליסטי, אם בין דמוקרטיה לאומית להשפעות ניאו-ליברליות. המרצאה הראשונה להיום היא נינה מונטמן. נינה עומדת בראש המחלקה להיסטוריה ותיאוריה באקדמיה המלכותית בסטוקהולם, יוצרת ומבקרת עצמאית. כותרת ההרצאה שלה היא נרטיבים פוסט-לאומיים של שייכות. אני רוצה שוב להודות לכל המשתתפים והאורחים ולכל הצוות שעזר להכין את הכנס שעבדנו ביחד.
Hello everybody, and thanks to David and Ayal for inviting me to this conference, which I think is at this point of time a very important event. And dear translator, I'm not an artist. I'm a curator and critic. I will talk about the current changes of art institutions, what also Dalit was referring to very briefly, that art institutions are changing in the current scenario of neo-capitalism, in the societal changes of neo-capitalism, and I will refer to the connection of these societal changes and the changes of art institutions. Replying to the question, what for him would be an ideal art institution, Alessio Antonioli, the director of Gasworks in London, replied, "The ideal art institution is not an institution." What Antonioli actually wants to say by this is that the ideal art institution has to abandon its political, strategical function and instead has to act out of reach of governmental influence. But how does this influence actually look like in the age of global capitalism that produces free market global managerial states merely led by economic interests? Let me start by examining how the institution is positioning itself in relation to the current respective form of government. Institutions, and therefore, of course, also art institutions, are by definition instruments or platforms for a prevailing order of social values. The language philosopher John Searle prefaces his ontological investigation of institutions by the following basic assumption. An institution is any collectively accepted system of rules, procedures, practices that enables us to create institutional facts. In this statement, we can find two important terms characterizing an institution. One is the concept of the collective, and the other is the system of rules. These two notions provide the basic parameters for an institution. From this, it can be concluded that, conversely, society, when it acts through its institutions, follows a logical structure. Ideally, society and institutions therefore give each other a kind of structural grip and thus open up for each other a mutual potential for action, which, however, is accompanied by the side effects of bureaucracy, hierarchical paternalism, exclusion, and generalization. We all know about this. Now there is a multitude of different art institutions, like museums, Kunsthalle, the German Kunstvereine, independent spaces, artist-run spaces, university galleries, and so on. And it can be noted that the more official an institution is, the more public it has in the sense of broad and diverse attention. And conversely, the further it is removed from an official institutional status, the more independent it is, and the smaller are the public groups which feel themselves addressed by them and belonging to them. Art institutions, as distinct from other institutions such as state authorities, parties, and trade unions, are not given any direct participation in political processes. Instead, they are given the indirect commission to produce images of realities, which makes them easier to consume, or to design a parallel universe which either appears as spiritually separated, a world in which the visitors can lose themselves, or it is supposed to entertain the visitors. The fulfillment of this tacit commission is generally accompanied by the reward of simplified fundraising. Art institutions, however, are not as clearly linked to the official societal narrative as other institutions are, but rather act according to the venerable arm's length principle. Therefore, they also have an individual and changeable profile, which gives their actors a relatively large room for maneuver. Thus, for instance, the director of an art institution, while keeping to certain boundary conditions, can adopt a new programmatic direction, in this way addressing or producing new publics. Because of the difficulty of controlling them, these publics, the institutions, in this process, art institutions also have a certain critical potential, which is not enjoyed by other institutions, which indeed exist in order to regulate and legitimate a certain hegemonic social form. But this critical potential is at stake. Today, the project of art institutions is coined or at least influenced by the dependency on external and increasingly private funding, which implies the mission to attract the masses and deliver visitors' numbers to the funding bodies. Since institutions, in their very nature, relate to the general value system of a society, one could say that the corporate turn in the institutional landscape, which I will describe more closely soon, corporate turn mirrors the general power relations of a late capitalist neoliberal constitution. But let us first have a look at the historical role of the museum in society and its function as a public institution. In the beginning of the museum in the 18th century, alongside the power of the state in forming the social order, the museum was a national project. It was founded with the British Museum as the first example, which was opened in 1759, and the Louvre followed shortly after. Its mission was to create the narrative of a representative national history and heritage. In accordance with this, its ideal audience was educated in being the model citizen, patriotic, conscious and proud of a rich history, superior to other nations. At this point, it is worth having a look at how we can define the nation in relation to the state. While the state can be described as a political territorial structure, the nation offers the ideological backup for the state. It constitutes a certain referential value system for the identity politics of the national community in terms of language, religion, heritage, or culture. People who, with the utmost probability, never meet each other are defined as a community under the national banner. So national community consists of people who probably will never meet each other or exchange. It was Benedict Anderson who wrote in his pioneering work, Imagined Communities, about the fictive character of these national communities, whose members don't know each other, share no interests or ideas. Since the publication of his book in 1983, therefore the nation can no longer be thought of without a fictive and ideological backdrop in the process of the formation of its identity. Anderson is also referring to a museumizing imagination that is translating the fictive and symbolic concept of nationalism into an environment of objects and images. Such a public institution is constitutionally open to everybody, but in fact, it provides a limited and encoded accessibility that confirms the bourgeois and patriotic subject as the ideal citizen. So we are still talking about the National Museum. Above that, it also imagines the world order from the perspective of the colonizer by showing a collection of the masterpieces of national artifacts, plus acquired trophies from the cradles of culture and art, like Egypt or Greece, which are thereby put in a direct lineage with the contemporary national culture. In contrast to this, we find an ethnicizing presentation of artifacts from the colonies. Now I'm still talking about these early museums, the British Museum, the Louvre, and so on. In contrast to this, we find an ethnicizing presentation of artifacts from the colonies, which in the context of the imperialistic narrative appears as folk art, the practical value of which, in spiritual as well as everyday contexts, even highlights the achievement of civilization, which gives way to the autonomous masterpiece. The initial project of the museum was accordingly, now I'm quoting Hito Steyer, initial project was accordingly the authoritarian legitimation of the nation-state through the construction of a history, a patrimony, and a canon. Today, in neo-capitalist societies, art institutions are becoming branded spaces, increasingly spreading according to the principle of franchising, like the Tate or the Guggenheim, and the private financiers are, as a rule, not so much interested in attending the museum they possibly support, but in using it as a tool for image production and finally for the profit of the company. The ideal audience, accordingly, is represented by a mass of anonymous consumers. This corporate model of an art institution, to which we can count all the major museums, like again the Guggenheim, which is the clearest example of an art institution, which is conceived and staged by politicians and financiers, the Tate and even the MoMA, but also increasingly mid-sized Kunsthallen and even smaller institutions. This corporate model of an art institution has a peer group of speculators who potentially identify more with the Guggenheim brand rather than with its program, and a non-specific public measured in numbers. Hence, it may be rightly claimed that 1 million visitors will turn up annually at the Guggenheim Bilbao, no matter what exhibition is in show. There was a survey recently undertaken by Paul O'Neill, a London-based curator and researcher. Visitors were asked in Bilbao, just before entering the Guggenheim, if they know which exhibition we'll see. Now guess how many knew? The result was that 9%, in words, 9% of the visitors about to enter the museum knew which show was on display. And I think this is a really interesting development also Galit was referring to, that the architecture and the building becomes more and more important. And if there are public investments, it mostly goes into the building and into paying for an internationally renowned architect. And that the architecture of the museum is like a tourist attraction, and therefore sculpture-like architecture, like the Guggenheim Bilbao, is preferred. Actually, the Guggenheim Bilbao was a permission to Frank Gehry to rebuild his opera house in Los Angeles. So he built a very similar building before in Los Angeles, the Opera House, and this is of course spectacular. It's really spectacular, and it also works very well in terms of acoustics and so on. But despite all these facts that this architecture was meant to house an opera house, they wanted exactly the same thing in Bilbao, and it looks also very similar, I must say. And it was part of an urban renewal plan. So the economies in Bilbao went down. It was until the 70s, Bilbao was a very vibrant industrial city, and then economies went down and frightening. And therefore, the local politicians were designing a city renewal plan. And the Guggenheim was the major part, was the central part of this city or this urban renewal plan. And it actually worked now. Since then, 1 million visitors are coming to Bilbao. And it's the average expense they leave in the city is €300. And also it was really interesting. I was once there. I was invited by ARCO, by the art fair in Madrid, together with a group of curators and critics to visit ARCO, and then they brought us to Bilbao later on. And we had 1.5 days in Bilbao, and the only program we had was the Guggenheim and the casino. And then, of course, spend some time in the city and go shopping. And that was the time when Chus Martinez was still at Sala Recalde. And therefore I said, it would be really interesting for us to go there. So this is an institution, this is for us, for this professional group of curators and critics, mostly dealing with contemporary art, or exclusively dealing with contemporary art. It's maybe the much more interesting institution. And so I was dragging some of my colleagues to Sala Recalde, which the organizers really disliked, because it was like 2 or 3 hours of time they wanted us to spend in the city. So that was really interesting to see. Also, this trip was organized by the Spanish tourist, ministry or institution, whatever, and together with ARCO. So there was this collaboration from the beginning on. So much about Bilbao. Apart from the privatization of the budget, the corporate turn includes also a changed profile for the curators and directors, who are increasingly appointed for their management qualities, as well as their abilities for marketing and as populist politicians. While the institution's program is judged from the viewpoint of profitability, visitors count and so on. If therefore in neo-capitalism there is a general social tendency to superimpose private interests on the public interest, as a consequence, the profiles for action of public positions change accordingly, including the duties of the institution's employees. It's also a development we can notice in public space. The public space is privatized more and more, so there's this layer of privatization is covering up the public arena. The question of what an art institution itself not its stakeholders, actually want from its audience, of course, differs widely from the economical pressures forced upon an institution and the resulting populist idea of an audience. In consideration of these facts, the following questions are vital. How can an institution emancipate itself from these dependencies? And what does it mean to formulate a critical position in the present context? Can the discussion on the conditions of production be carried out within the institutions themselves? And what are the consequences for their internal structures, functionality, programming, and projections? Or, to quote Hito Steyerl again, who is a filmmaker and writer from Austria, to quote Hito Steyerl, is it not rather absurd to argue that something like an institution of critique exists at a time when critical cultural institutions are clearly being dismantled, underfunded, and subjected to the demands of a neoliberal event economy? Which leads us back to Bilbao. In this current situation, which goes hand in hand with the dismantling of the welfare state, a new orientation for emancipatory forms of action in the institutionalized art field appears to be needed. This, first of all, brings us back to a very fundamental question. What do we actually expect from an art institution? What do we want an institution to stand for? And interrelated with these issues, the main question remains, who can be the peer group for a new transgressive art institution? How can an art institution relate to diverse public groups and by this create an active agency within the public sphere, an active agency that is powerful enough in society to defend a new institutional model? Because the critical institutions, the critical model doesn't have a very powerful structure in society. Therefore, it's very easy to close one after the other down. With this intention, the model of a relational institution seems currently attractive to some curators. The relational institution implies that the institution is defining itself through its relations to various public groups. I think I skipped one aspect here. Instead of a general opening of the building, the multiplication of different events and a curatorial innovation, relational institutions are more interested, or the curators working on relational institutions, are more interested in practicing a certain withdrawal that enables the institution to develop a targeted approach to specific groups, to find allies for interventions in the public realm, and to establish more constant relations to specific publics that sympathize with their approach. So not opening up for the masses and just try to get anybody in, but to really have an exchange with a specific public group who is bringing in an interest for the program. The MACBA in Barcelona, Museo d'Arte Contemporani, Barcelona, a museum that often claims to be a mainstream in these efforts, developed in recent years several projects that have sought to propose new ways in which art can exist in the public sphere. In 2005 and 2006, they held a conference in two parts with the title Another Relationality, Rethinking Art as Experience. In the outline, MACBA also clearly defined their position on the subject. They said, relationality is a concept that enables us to intervene controversially in the debate on art institutions and their audiences. From the standpoint of the museum, we understand the relational as a space for art that temporarily suspends institutional autonomy and explores new forms of interaction with the social. We seek ways in which art can make a meaningful contribution through its specific nature to multiplying public spheres. And this process can be defined in terms of relations between different subjects, different forms, different spaces. I think it's interesting that they said that they understand the relational as a space for art that temporarily suspends institutional autonomy. So they are willing to suspend their institutional autonomy temporarily to relate to specific new publics. And this also says that they think the institutional autonomy is an obstacle to really working with new publics and really have publics attending the museum that are interested in the program and also want to participate. So that institutional autonomy and participation of public groups is doesn't go together. At the same time, the Bildmuseet in Umeå in Sweden, in in collaboration with the artist Apolonia Šustasić and the architect Maike Schalk, started a long-term project with the title The Relational Museum, which is including workshops, seminars, public meetings, publications, site-specific art projects, and other activities and events, with the aim to explore the relations between the Museum of Contemporary Art and its contexts, audiences, publics. They are asking themselves, what kinds of social, public, and civic spaces does the Contemporary Art institution generate and produce? What are the social, political situations engendered? Which encounters are made possible? In this project, Bildmuseet itself, as an imaginary and real entity, would be the particular case study. Both MACBA and Bildmuseet are questioning their own position in the public realm and try to consciously produce diverse public spheres. They both ask questions fundamental to the future of the museum as a public institution with a more and more privatized public realm. The idea of the relational experience makes me reflect on the notion of belonging, which I consider crucial in current societal developments. Since the nation-state offered the dominant historic backdrop for the ideas of belonging, national identity, its current decline gives ways for new ideas and also initiatives of belonging and participation. One very practical example is concerning the welfare services, which are more and more thrown back onto individual responsibilities. Besides precarious lifestyles, this also induces collective activities like participation in NGOs or neighborhood organizations. The sense of community, therefore, appears more self-made, though, of course, out of pressing necessity. In this current scenario of unstable post-national narratives of belonging, the art institution could serve as a platform to rethink the fundamental issues of belonging and participation. These kinds of progressive institutional practices, on the one hand, have to use the institution's participation in semi-public spheres, which is still there, and on the other hand, emancipated from the branded structures of the globalized state with a neoliberal agenda and management functions. Trying to anchor the subversive potential to implement an alternative narrative and pointing out the importance of the social imaginary in this process, I would like to refer to the philosopher Charles Taylor, who speaks in an article in the magazine Public Culture of institutions as places where people can imagine their existence as part of a larger social structure, also fashioning their social relationships, what they expect from them, and also which normative pressure these relationships are subject to. This is particularly true for art institutions, where the visitor's framework for action is negotiable, not as clearly as your attendance or your participation in other institutions. Thinking of a common narrative, an emancipatory sense of belonging has to formulate in contrast to a historic belonging, which, as I said before, lies in national identity. Belonging, instead, has to be imagined in connection with participation, an idea of participation that consequently tends towards belonging without belonging. This concept is recalling Jean-Luc Nancy's inoperative community, a community that doesn't allow to be exploited, that is anti-essentialist. Belonging to this community merely requires a being in the world. This is what he means by belonging without belonging. Belonging doesn't mean that you have to identify with something. You don't have to bring any qualities to belong to a community, but just being in the world, it's just required to exist, to be in the world, to belong to a certain community. Or a singularity without identity, as Giorgio Agamben puts it similarly. He talks about singularity and not about individualities. Singularity without identity, which means exactly the same, actually, as Nancy's concept of belonging without belonging. This definition of belonging is linked to the hope for a transnational idea of participation in democratic processes. Taking these considerations into account in thinking of a future art institution, consequently, the ideal art institution is an institution that doesn't act like an institution in the classical sense, but gives space for the social imaginary of new communities. These new communities question the national, religious, or ethnic frame and are neither locally nor culturally bound, and by this replace unitary and essentialist models of a community that is based on presence, identification, and immanence, and which is also referred to in totalitarian and foundational political regimes, and that underlay political populism as well. The concept of a community that refuses to function as a manipulative mass united by a common identity eventually applies the potential to resist the global competition and create an alternative transnational narrative. The transformative public potential of a so-structured institution lies in creating diasporic public spheres, as they are described by Arjun Appadurai. Appadurai says that these diasporic public spheres are phenomena that confound theories that depend on the continued salience of the nation-state as the key arbiter of important social changes. Precisely in this lies both an internationalization as well as a democratization of the art institution and its research facilities, which not only breaks down or questions certain dominant forms of institutional politics, but also opens up a new role for the imagination in social life. As with all institutional models, here too the question is posed concerning adequate financing. There is no question that the financing of art institutions everywhere represents a growing problem. But it cannot be the only solution to consume oneself in permanent fundraising and to develop avenue strategies for how to keep playing in the great game. It is apparent that an institution casting emancipatory ideas for the use of the public realm cannot fall back on the general strategies for fundraising. The question concerning how such models are to be financed coincides with the question concerning who is at all interested in supporting art institutions which do not give back what counts in the dominant contemporary social forms, namely an effective production of mass image and the revenue from a paying mass public. So institutions that don't pay back in the same currency that is valid at the moment, of course, they don't raise so much interest for people to support it. Private and public, thematically oriented foundations, whose interests are freed from a Western standard of exhibition policy and which try to establish self-determined transnational structures, provide a ray of hope for future financing models. Even if the major financial sources keep a distance, it is nevertheless rewarding for the sake of emancipatory publics to exploit the special status of the art institution and to play the wild child among all the other institutions. Thank you very much.